let's just start with a quick introduction for anyone here who maybe doesn't know you. Paloma, do you want to start really quick for us?
Hi everyone, my name is Paloma Costa. I am a social environmentalist lawyer from Brazil.
Johar everyone, my name is Archana Soreng and I come from Khariya tribe, an indigenous community from India, and I'm a researcher working on indigenous people and climate action.
And I'm Nathan. I'm a 23 years old climate justice and LGBTQI2S+ activist. I come from France, but I'm based in Canada.
Amazing. And we were just talking for a few minutes in the back. You all are part of the UN climate group as a second job, right? This is, you have full-time jobs, but this is also an additional full-time job. And you've been here this whole week having meetings, having negotiations. Let's just start off with your pulse, the temperature of the talks. I mean, where do you guys think you are right now? Are you optimistic about what you're hearing from world leaders? Paloma?
I mean, optimistic is not the right word, right? We are in a climate collapse. But I think like a lot of leaders are starting to understand what is the needed thing we should do. And I think this is finance implementation. So I'm hearing a lot. I want to see the implementation and the action going. So let's see.
Archana, what about you?
COP26 was really historic for indigenous people as we had the $1.7 US billion committed to rights of indigenous people. I'm looking forward to implementation of it in COP27 and most importantly in terms of access to indigenous people and local communities and transparency. And yes, I'm looking forward to have NDCs of countries incorporate rights of indigenous people and traditional knowledge and practices of indigenous people.
Nathan?
Yeah, I think for me, it's also looking at implementation. Like Paloma, we have a Paris Agreement. We have a roadmap. We know what we need to do. And so today, COPs are much more about convening, and this event, other events are here to convene. And I think for us, what's the most important is how do we make sure that we have strong movements, strong civil societies all around the world that can push for implementation, because clearly, when you don't hold policymakers accountable, they don't keep their promises. And we're seeing that right now with so many of the leaders, even in the 2 years we've been youth advisors. So for me, the most important is keeping that up to make sure we hold accountable the policymakers.
Well, and part of that is what you say is funding, right? I mean, your movements, youth movements, need funding. Can you talk about that? Because the implementation is really on the policymakers, right? So what is it that you're communicating to them about the funding aspect of it?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, like, and Bloomberg Green has been great at doing that. You've been profiling us, and we are making the headlines. I think today people are realizing the work we're doing as youth climate movements. We're, you know, like we were with the UN Secretary General yesterday, Macron on Monday. We're running after this event to meet with John Kerry. So we have
name dropping right there, right?
Just to make sure people also understand that we are playing an essential part. Yet we launched this study yesterday, and actually only 0.76% of global climate philanthropy goes to youth climate movements. This is $14 million on average per year. So we've been able to do all this incredible work all around the world, holding policymakers accountable with literally no funding. And so for us, this COP is also about that. How can we make sure that philanthropies, governments, and institutions are genuinely committed to fund youth movements, to support the work we're doing, and to do much more?
Well, what does that funding go towards, Paloma?
That's what I was going to say, because you said implementation is for decision makers, and honestly, who is holding the forest, standing, for example, the Amazon? It is me and my friends who are doing that. If we still have an Amazon, it's because there is people there sustaining their forests, being threatened with their own bodies, and standing with the forest. So I think like when we talk about implementation, about building up a structure for youth-led from climate justice initiatives to be founded, to have the opportunity to be implemented, we are talking about sustaining this entire world, reforestating conscience, minds, and making sure that we have a planet still living. Because it's young people in the front that are sustaining all of it.
Archana, what does that look like in India? I mean, what would additional funding for youth climate movements there look like in terms of what Paloma was talking about?
Yeah, As I said, I think it's really critical for us, young people and indigenous people, Afro-descendants and local communities to access these resources. We are talking about loss and damage finance, we are talking about climate finance in terms of adaptation and resilience, but where does the money go? It's still not accessible to the communities on ground, and that's why we need support and solidarity where we are being able to access this allocation, which will come with structural changes and with a lot of specific efforts made to reach out to the communities on ground. Because I would like to also emphasize on language diversity, because a lot of information is also not available on ground to how to access these resources. And that's where I feel it's very critical to make effort in an institutional approach rooted in justice and human rights-based approach, that we go to communities and make them accessible so that we can combat climate crisis.
Is that happening globally enough, do you think?
I think it's not enough. We need to do more.
And let's talk, because I think what was really interesting for me just going into this COP, I was seeing a lot of criticism from some youth activists who did not want to be a part of it. I'm curious, just from the three of you, why being here was so critical for you. I mean, what was it about these 2 weeks that you felt the need to be here physically to address some of these issues? Nathan?
Yeah, I mean, of course, like, you know, I'm a queer person, and so being here in Egypt is very difficult, and yet I come here as, you know, this UN representative through the group, and so I'm protected, but what about the others? And what about so many people who are also facing human rights abused in certain countries? And so I think there was a lot of worries for a lot of activists, and yet even if we're doing essential work, so many young people are being threatened, are being jailed, are being sometimes even killed and harmed in countries. So the protection of environmental defenders, the protection of young environmental defenders is something that is essential. And we are here at COP with some key leaders from the youth climate movement who are faced and who have been jailed in the past. So that was one of the very big worries around this COP, of course. But I think another thing that is essential for our movements, and also for all of you, I guess, is being able to meet and to be together. And for the first time in history, we have a youth pavilion, which is a youth pavilion that is completely youth-led. So we decided what we wanted, we decided the programming, we decided what we wanted to do. And I had this reflection this morning with Paloma. It's so incredibly powerful to have this space together, because COP are a very unhealthy space, you know, like all those pavilions, all those different event spaces, and being able to be together, I think it's really powerful for the movements, because as I was saying before, the implementation is the more important, and therefore us being able to connect, to share information, to have this solidarity, that's what helps us to, you know, hold policymakers accountable on an everyday basis.
Yeah, jump in.
No, I just wanted to add like a little bit, because for me, this is my 4th COP, and it's the first time that I come to a COP with a hotel secure for myself and for my delegation, so thanks Bloomberg for that. But honestly, like, why do we pass so much stress? It's so expensive for people from, like me, like Archana, to come from our different countries to be here. It's so stressful. We don't have credit cards, and we pass so many difficulties that I think people not even imagine. And why that? Because we are talking with decision makers. We had hotels secure for young people because of something that we standed up. We had 1.7 billion for indigenous people, even though we still have to figure out how this money is coming for the communities and so on. So I think like young people, they are not only observers, but they are the time track, because we are here saying we need action, we are doing action. What you are talking about, it's been 27 years at least of conversation. Yeah. Now it's time to act.
Absolutely. Archana, do you want to add in?
Yeah, I would really like to emphasize that, as Paloma said, like a lot of our friends and colleagues and young people from those who are impacted by climate crisis have not been able to access these spaces because of lack of accreditation and funding. So it's like, you know, mere participation is also at stake. And that's where we need really fund allocations to young people and to support youth movements. We speak about meaningful leadership. How will we have meaningful leadership when we are not being able to access this space spaces because of this restriction. And I would also like to say that being part of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on climate change, one thing which I really appreciate and like about this space is that we have a safe and enabling spaces to be very honest and frank and direct to Secretary General. We need more spaces in the decision-making processes, in the country levels and local levels where we can directly speak to power and work together.
And how do you take that momentum and that solidarity that you guys have found here at COP and sort of spread it out across the world when you're not in front of world leaders? And like you were mentioning, Nathan, some people are not even safe, right, to be able to make their voices heard. So I guess not the three of you, but is there something that leaders can maybe do to better support that and help keep the momentum with your organizations?
I mean, I think when people, for example, see my work, they see me here, sitting here with a lot of spotlight and so on. But the real work that we are doing, and I think this is what is needed to be supported, and that we have like finance coming, cooperation and so on. It's, for example, coming to the Munduruku territory, which is not demarcated in Brazil, and form 200 indigenous youth on climate, on elections. We change president, we change the ways things are going, and we have a plan for years and years on how we are going to implement, like in economy, in education, and so on. This is the real work, like to act locally but think globally.
Nathan?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really important is these conferences have been overemphasizing the question of climate mitigation. And what we have been pushing for as the youth climate movement is something that we call climate justice. Because the reality is, if you push governments to mitigate and to make sure that, you know, it's all about greenhouse gas, it's all about renewable energy, it's all about, you know, technologies, then the people just don't get it, and the people don't vote for the policymakers who push for that. Because if the climate policies you are implementing are not fair and just, then the people will just not elect you anymore. And then that's how we end up with a Bolsonaro, with a Donald Trump, with a Meloni in Italy. And so for me, what's really essential, and I think we really brought the UN Secretary General on a journey, among other leaders, in thinking more about how can we think not just about the energy transition or just, you know, climate action, but about climate justice, about just transition. And I think this is really, really essential, and it's part of all the different narratives that I think the youth climate movement is pushing for. And so for me, today, supporting the youth climate movement is honestly the best, you know, like thing you can do in pushing policymakers to actually act for transitions that are sustainable. Because if you just do transitions that are unfair, they will never be sustaining, and therefore they will just be unlocked and, you know, completely destroyed by the policymakers who come from populist governments or conservative governments.
And if I might add, only think for their period of power and not think beyond.
Period of...
Yeah, of governance, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
The only thing like to do things to get voted again for these 4 years or whatever they have in power.
Right, and Paloma, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit. You have a new president, obviously. He's going to be coming next week. What is that engagement going to be like? What have you sort of, give us a little window into what the engagement between the youth activists and the administration will be?
We really expect that now that we have the opportunity to have a government open for dialogue, that we have, for example, again, the Amazon Fund into working, the Climate Fund functioning, that he has like a climate secretariat. This is not a reality for me right now in my country, that he has, for example, a youth advisory group that can support him on the way forward. So I really hope that this was not just electoral promises, but actual implementation. And I mean, let's do it. We are open to it.
You're optimistic about that.
And he knows.
Archana, what is progress for you? Because as we know, you're from India. What does that look like for you from some of the policymakers?
Well, I have been advocating for it, and I would like to reiterate that, you know, indigenous people, young people, and local communities should be leaders of climate action and not victims of climate policies. When I say this, it's really critical in the policy making spaces. Youth, indigenous people, local communities, and all the marginalized communities are part of decision making processes. Because if there is no free, prior, and informed consent, if there is no participation of people in the policy making, then those policies make them more further marginalized and make them more vulnerable, because these policies then work in a very contradictory manner. And I think it's really critical to also emphasize on a global perspective that how we see an intersectionality between climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Often we, try to make it a separate and segregate, like mitigation, adaptation, resilience. But for the communities on ground, we all are facing the impact of climate crisis. We were facing the impacts of COVID, and at many places we are still are. And it was really very critical facing COVID and climate crisis at the same time, when there was loss of livelihood, culture, life. And we cannot have policies which is making us more vulnerable. Rather, a holistic approach of policies rooted in justice and human rights-based approach is really, really critical.
Have you seen that yet this week since being at COP? Have you seen any of those discussions sort of leading into what you're saying?
I feel there is a lot of momentum at this moment, because we all, young people, have been advocating for human rights-based approach. We have been advocating for climate justice. But I think it all needs to come from policymakers as an intent from them also. We cannot advocate, being young people, that you need to do this if there is no willpower and no intent. And that's why I feel it's a journey where we are wanting to make difference, and it comes from a personal intent and willingness.
Well, and there's the discussion too about the next generation of climate leaders, right? It's going to be people like you all. Do you feel like that empowerment does need to come from policymakers? They need to be the ones empowering young people to sort of step up to the plate more, Nathan?
They need the one to be empowered by young people, not the other way around. I think this is the powerful thing, is I think when you are genuinely connected to a movement like we have been, right? Like, we speak to each other every single day. Imagine the power of this, right? Like, if someone is getting harassed, or if someone is realizing that their governments are not doing enough, they can tell us. We have this solidarity. And I think one of the most incredible things, because most of my activism has been in Europe, and especially in Brussels, is that sometimes, of course, communities and youth movements in the global south would tell us, look, like, actually what's happening in the Amazon, what's happening in my country, it's policies made in Brussels. And therefore, as Global North youth, you have an essential responsibility in denouncing that and holding your policymakers accountable. So it's never been just about us and our own, countries, or for us, our own European Union, but it's always been about this international solidarity. And so for me, this is the power of this movement, is thanks to the social media, thanks to communication, we build that power, which is unequal. And I want to remember everyone here that is proven now that we led the largest environmental movement in history. The 2019, 2020 strikes, this is what we hold. And we talk to policymakers like Frans Timmermans, with the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, telling us, like, I would have never done the European Green Deal if you wouldn't have been in the streets and in the backstage to ask me for it. And I think this is the power. So we need to keep that power going. I think it comes through intergenerational transfer and support. I think, for organizations like Bloomberg Philanthropies, for other philanthropies, it's essential that they step in and support youth climate movement in a way that is horizontal, that is, without strings attached, that is actually genuine. Because we have a power, and this power needs to be supported. And it's a little bit of a call as well to philanthropies in general.
Genuine. Paloma?
And to be honest, I don't think we are the next generation of leaders, because we are leaders right now in our own realities. And I think it's a lot on what Nathan said. Like, we were on the streets, we're still on the streets, but we also went to Supreme Courts, we went to formal spaces. Now we have youth negotiators. And I told you before, this is my 4th COP. Like, for example, the Brazilian delegation, the LAC delegation, the Global Youth delegation, They were so small in the first COP I came, and now we are a big group. We have a pavilion, we have strength, we know what is our power. So we are here to make everyone accountable and to implement what they are promising, because there is no sense that people do a lot of commitments, come here to international conference and say they are going to do that, like the forest agreement, and we are still waiting how this agreement is going to be implemented, the indigenous fund and so on. So it's not about just talking, we want to see and we will push for action.
And we know today is a formally Youth Day.
Congrats to us!
I feel like every day is Youth Day.
Every day is
for you
Youth
all.
Day.
And you mentioned you're going to be meeting with U.S. Climate Envoy John Kerry. Are you going to be telling him anything specific? Is it sort of what you've just outlined here? I mean, what is it that you want to see from a country like the U.S.?
I would really like to see like country from US to advocate and champion for rights of indigenous people and local communities, and more so being a championing where we're calling upon countries to incorporate in their NDCs about rights of indigenous people and supporting their traditional knowledge and practices. So this is what I would I'll be telling him. But apart from that, I would also like to add on that now we are talking about youth leadership, but I would like to emphasize like we still have a very less representation from Asia. We need more young people from Asia. And being from Asia, I feel that there is lack of resources coming to Asia, and it's very difficult for young people to access these decision-making spaces. And most importantly, it also comes down to that how we young people, everyone is working in this space in a volunteer capacity. And it's very difficult to sustain, like at a point of time, you have to either look for your education, job, or your continue activism. And I think that's what is really important, that this spaces we are in the decision-making spaces, everyone can contribute in their own way. I'm a researcher, and we have lawyers, and we have writers and communicators, and a lot more. We young people are unique in our own way and can contribute in a unique way to climate action.
And you mentioned your jobs are forgiving for the amount of time that you have to put into this. But you're saying it's not necessarily the case for some people in Asia, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I'm supposed to leave a few minutes for questions. Yes, do we have any? Okay.
I think, it's really essential, like climate mitigation, but I think a lot of the thing we've tried to say today is also that, it's not just about emission, it's not just about that, it's actually about a much more, system change that also is about climate adaptation, also about loss and damage, also about just policies that are, supporting welfare states, that are supporting states that are supporting the poor. And, I was with Macron on Monday, and he has this whole conversation, but, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emission, we need to upscale renewable energy. But the real question is that people in France, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, cannot afford to have food, cannot afford to, pay their rent. And I think this is the real question. And as individual activists, we even struggle with that. So that would be my take on that question.
For youth who want to focus on addressing climate issues, would you encourage them to focus their time on policy and rhetoric, or to learning the hard sciences, technology, and engineering skills to actually create climate solutions?
As I said, we all young people are unique, and it's important for young people to be in different spaces, and we also consider ourselves as professionals in our different thematics. So I think it's really critical for young people to choose the profession which they like in order to contribute to climate action and also decision-making processes, because we need scientists, we need researchers, we need community mobilizers, and we need young people at different levels in different thematics, expertise, and decision-making processes.
Paloma, you want to jump in? You want to say?
No. You can go ahead.
Just co-signing.
She did it.
One last one. How can Indigenous youth better have their voices heard at COP?
I think it's very sad that even after so many years of COP, we barely have an adequate Indigenous youth representation in COP. And it's really sad that Even in countries NDC, we do not have the word indigenous peoples, local communities, indigenous youth mentioned. And if it is not there in the NDCs, then how will the implementation happen on ground? So I think it's really critical in order to attain the goals of Paris Agreement and climate action. We need to have the rights of indigenous people and local communities over the land, forests, and territory, meaningful leadership of indigenous youth, supporting the traditional knowledge and practices incorporated in the NDCs. And the countries, those who have already incorporated, to implement it. And that is where it starts. And then it's really important to identify indigenous youth, support indigenous youth, and more so ensure that indigenous youth are part of the processes and their entrepreneurs and skills are supported.
Now I want to jump in. If I might just add a little bit on that, like I really believe that we are talking with Macron, Lula, Kerry, and so on, but because we went for the meetings. Imagine if we had like a space where we could gather with decision makers, with head of philanthropic organizations, with different sectors, with really time to have honest and real conversations on what are the initiatives that we've been doing that we see are good, on the things that they have as priority and how we can combine and uplift all of these initiatives. I don't see space for that except for the ones that we actually create.
So more action. All right, I think we have to leave it there. Paloma, Archana, Nathan, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.